The steady hum of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and hushed conversations filled the corridors of St. Vincent's Hospital. It was a world of controlled chaos, where exhaustion hung in the air like a persistent fog, but so did purpose. For Dr. Melissa Carter, that purpose was the only thing that mattered. A highly skilled trauma surgeon, Melissa was known for her razor-sharp precision and even sharper attitude. She was efficient, relentless, and utterly intolerant of incompetence. Patients came first, and nothing else mattered. So, when the hospital announced the arrival of a new head nurse in the emergency department, Melissa barely looked up from her charts. It was just another person she'd have to depend on, and likely be disappointed by. Kate Dawson, however, was far from just another nurse. She entered the hospital with a reputation of her own, fiercely competent, unflappable in the face of chaos, and possessing a natural warmth that made patients adore her. Kate had spent years refining her skills in some of the toughest emergency rooms in the country. But what truly set her apart was her refusal to bow down to arrogance, something she recognized immediately in Dr. Carter. Their first interaction was less than ideal. "You're in my way," Melissa snapped, barely glancing at Kate as she reached for the intubation tray during a high-pressure trauma case. Kate, unfazed, met Melissa's icy stare with calm defiance. "And you're forgetting to communicate with your team." A flicker of annoyance crossed Melissa's features. She wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by someone she'd only just met. But there was no time for arguments. The patient on the table was fighting for their life. Kate worked seamlessly, anticipating needs before they were spoken, her movements fluid and confident. By the time the patient was stabilized, Melissa begrudgingly admitted, if only to herself, that Kate was good. Very good. But respect did not mean friendship. For weeks, they clashed. Kate's warmth clashed with Melissa's frost. Where Kate advocated for more patience with overwhelmed residents, Melissa demanded discipline. Where Kate saw the value in comforting words, Melissa saw wasted time. And yet, there was something electrifying about their dynamic. The hospital buzzed with the tension between them, a palpable energy that neither could explain nor acknowledge. Until one night changed everything. A mass trauma incident flooded the ER with patients, stretching the staff to their limits. Melissa and Kate found themselves side by side for hours, moving with practiced efficiency, exhaustion numbing the sharp edges of their usual clashes. Amid the chaos, their gazes met more than once. Brief, unguarded moments, where the world outside of that moment ceased to exist. At the end of it all, long past midnight, they stood outside the hospital in the cool night air, silent except for the occasional hum of the city beyond. "You're not as awful as I thought," Kate admitted, her voice laced with exhaustion, but also something else, something softer. Melissa huffed a quiet laugh, rubbing a hand over her face. "I could say the same about you." A pause, a shift in the air. Neither spoke about the way their eyes lingered on each other before they finally parted ways, each carrying the weight of something new and unspoken. Something that neither of them was ready to face just yet. The tension between Melissa and Kate had become a constant undercurrent in the ER, a quiet hum beneath the chaos of their daily lives. They were like two magnets, repelling and attracting in equal measure, their clashes as inevitable as their moments of unspoken understanding. But something had shifted since that first night they'd worked side by side during the mass trauma incident. The sharp edges of their animosity had softened, replaced by something more complicated, something neither of them was ready to name. Melissa, for her part, was determined to ignore it. She had built her life on control, on precision, on the unshakable belief that emotions were a liability in their line of work. But Kate was a force of nature, relentless in her optimism and unyielding in her compassion, and she had a way of slipping past Melissa's defenses when she least expected it. It was a Thursday evening, and the ER was unusually quiet. The lull was a rare gift, a moment to catch their breath, but Melissa found herself restless. She sat in the break room, a stack of charts in front of her, her pen tapping impatiently against the table. She was halfway through a particularly tedious report when the door swung open, and Kate walked in. "Hey," Kate said, her voice warm and familiar. She dropped into the chair across from Melissa, her scrubs rumpled, and her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She looked exhausted, but somehow still radiant, and Melissa hated how much she noticed that. "Hey," Melissa replied, her tone clipped. She kept her eyes on the charts, determined to maintain her distance. Kate reached for the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup. "Rough day?" Melissa exhaled sharply. "Just another day in paradise." Kate chuckled, the sound low and melodic. "You know, sarcasm loses its charm when it's your only personality trait." Melissa shot her a look, but there was no real bite to it. "And relentless optimism gets exhausting." Kate smirked, leaning back in her chair. "Who said I'm always optimistic? I just happen to believe people are more than their worst moments." Melissa hesitated, something about those words settling uncomfortably in her chest. She wanted to dismiss it, to push Kate away like she always did, but instead, she found herself saying, "That's a dangerous way to think in this job." Kate sipped her coffee, her gaze steady. "Maybe, but I'd rather believe in people and be let down than never believe in them at all." Melissa had no response to that. Instead, she took a sip of her own coffee, the bitterness grounding her. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was something else, something that made her heart beat a little too fast. Later that night, as Melissa was finishing up her rounds, she found herself drawn to the pediatric ward. It wasn't part of her usual routine, but something about the day had left her unsettled. She stood in the doorway of a room, watching as a young girl slept peacefully, her small hand clutching a stuffed bear. The sight stirred something in Melissa, something she couldn't quite name. "She's going to be okay," a voice said softly behind her. Melissa turned to see Kate standing there, her expression gentle. "How do you know?" Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kate stepped closer, her eyes on the girl. "Because we did everything we could, and because sometimes that's enough." Melissa looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the cracks in Kate's armor, the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight of the lives they couldn't save, the quiet strength it took to keep going. It was a side of Kate she hadn't let herself see before, and it made her feel less alone. "You're not as infuriating as I thought," Melissa admitted, her voice soft. Kate smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "And you're not as cold as you pretend to be." Melissa huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Don't let it get around. I have a reputation to uphold." Kate's smile widened, and for a moment they just stood there, the weight of the day lifting ever so slightly. Then Kate reached out, her hand brushing Melissa's arm. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Melissa's breath caught at the touch, at the sincerity in Kate's words. She wanted to argue, to pull away, but instead, she found herself nodding. "I know." The next morning, the ER was back to its usual chaos. Melissa was in the middle of a high-stakes surgery when one of the residents froze, his hands trembling as he tried to suture a wound. Melissa's patience snapped. "If you can't handle the pressure, get out of my OR," she barked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The resident flinched, his face pale, but before Melissa could say more, Kate stepped in. "Why don't you take a breath?" she said to the resident, her voice calm but firm. "You've got this. Just focus." Melissa shot her a glare, but Kate met her gaze without flinching. "He's doing his best," Kate said quietly. "Cut him some slack." Melissa wanted to argue, to remind Kate that this wasn't a place for hand-holding, but the look in Kate's eyes stopped her. There was no judgment there, just understanding. And for the first time, Melissa wondered if maybe, just maybe, Kate was right. That evening, as they stood outside the hospital, the city lights casting a soft glow over them, Melissa found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "You make it look so easy," she said, her voice quiet. Kate turned to her, her brow furrowed. "What does?" "Caring," Melissa admitted. "I don't know how you do it." Kate smiled, but there was a sadness in it. "It's not easy, but it's worth it." Melissa looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, she let herself see the woman behind the nurse, the woman who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, but still found a way to smile. The woman who believed in people, even when they didn't believe in themselves. The woman who was slowly, inevitably, breaking down Melissa's walls. And for the first time, Melissa didn't want to stop her. The tension between Melissa and Kate had become a living, breathing thing. It was in the way their eyes lingered a fraction too long during rounds, the way their hands brushed when passing instruments, the way their voices softened when they spoke to each other in the quiet moments between crises. The hospital was a pressure cooker, and their unspoken feelings were the steam building inside, threatening to explode. One particularly grueling day tested them both. A young boy had been rushed into the ER after a bicycle accident, his small body broken and bleeding. Melissa had taken charge, her voice sharp and commanding as she barked orders at the team. Kate was at her side, steady and calm, her hands moving with practiced precision as she worked to stabilize the boy. For a moment, it seemed like they might lose him. His heart rate plummeted, and the room filled with the frantic beeping of monitors. Melissa's jaw tightened, her focus unshakable, but Kate saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. "We've got this," Kate murmured, her voice low and reassuring. "Stay with me, doctor." Melissa nodded, her gaze locking with Kate's for a brief, charged moment. Together, they fought to save the boy, and when his heart rate finally stabilized, the room exhaled in collective relief. Melissa stepped back, her hands trembling slightly, and Kate reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing Melissa's wrist. "You did good," Kate said softly. Melissa looked down at Kate's hand, then back up at her. "We did good," she corrected, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. The moment lingered, heavy with unspoken words, before the chaos of the ER pulled them apart once more. Later that night, long after the shift had ended, Melissa found herself in the supply room, restocking bandages and syringes. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The boy's pale face, the way Kate's voice had grounded her, the way her touch had sent a jolt of electricity through her veins. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear Kate enter until she spoke. "Couldn't sleep either?" Kate asked, leaning against the doorframe. Melissa turned, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of her. Kate's hair was loose, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and her scrubs were rumpled from the long day. She looked exhausted, but beautiful, and Melissa hated how much that affected her. "Too much on my mind," Melissa admitted, setting down the box she'd been holding. Kate stepped closer, her eyes searching Melissa's face. "You're always so hard on yourself. You know that, right?" Melissa crossed her arms, a defensive gesture. "I have to be. This job doesn't forgive mistakes." "No," Kate agreed, "but it also doesn't reward perfection. You're human, Melissa. You're allowed to feel things." Melissa's breath hitched at the way Kate said her name, softly, like it was something precious. She wanted to argue, to push her away like she always did, but something about the way Kate was looking at her made it impossible. "I don't know how to do this," Melissa whispered, her voice breaking. "Do what?" Kate asked, stepping even closer. "This," Melissa said, gesturing between them. "Whatever this is." Kate reached out, her fingers brushing Melissa's arm. "Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once. Maybe you just have to let yourself feel it." Melissa's resolve crumbled. She closed the distance between them, her hands cupping Kate's face as she kissed her. It was hesitant at first, a question more than a statement, but Kate responded instantly, her hands sliding around Melissa's waist to pull her closer. The kiss deepened, fueled by weeks of pent-up tension and longing, and for the first time in a long time, Melissa felt something other than control. She felt alive. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Melissa rested her forehead against Kate's. "This is a terrible idea," she murmured, though she made no move to step away. Kate smiled, her thumb brushing Melissa's cheek. "Maybe, but it's ours." The days that followed were a delicate dance. At work, they were careful, maintaining the professional boundaries that their jobs demanded. But in the quiet moments, when they passed each other in the hallway, when they shared a rare break in the staff room, when they lingered after a late shift, their connection was undeniable. It was in the way their eyes met across a crowded ER, the way their hands brushed when they reached for the same chart, the way their voices softened when they spoke to each other. But love in the hospital was never simple. The stakes were too high, the emotions too raw. Melissa found herself torn between the safety of distance and the pull of something she couldn't name. She had spent so long building walls around herself, and now Kate was tearing them down, brick by brick. One night, after an emotionally draining shift, Melissa found Kate waiting for her outside the hospital. The city lights cast a soft glow over her features, and for the first time in a long time, Melissa allowed herself to be vulnerable. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Kate stepped closer, her eyes filled with understanding. "Of what?" "Of this," Melissa said, gesturing between them. "Of what it means. Of what happens if it doesn't work." Kate reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm scared too, but I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." Melissa's breath caught at the raw honesty in Kate's words. She had spent so long running from her feelings, from the possibility of being hurt, but standing there with Kate, she realized something. Love wasn't about safety. It was about risk. It was about choosing someone, even when it was hard, even when it was terrifying. She pulled Kate into a kiss, this time with certainty. It was a promise, a declaration, a leap of faith. And when they finally pulled apart, Kate rested her forehead against Melissa's, her smile soft and knowing. "We're going to be okay," Kate said, her voice steady. Melissa nodded, her heart full. "We're going to be okay." Because love was never easy, but for them, it was worth it. The hospital was alive with its usual rhythm, beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and the low murmur of voices. But for Melissa, the world had shifted. The walls she had built so carefully, the ones meant to keep everyone out, were crumbling. And at the center of it all was Kate. Their relationship was still new, fragile, and unspoken to most of the hospital staff. They were careful, stealing moments in the supply room, lingering in the break room after shifts, exchanging glances across the ER that spoke volumes. But the weight of what they were building was undeniable. For the first time in her life, Melissa was learning what it meant to let someone in. One afternoon, the ER was hit with a sudden influx of patients from a multi-vehicle accident. Melissa and Kate fell into their usual rhythm, their movements synchronized, their communication seamless. But this time, there was something different, a quiet understanding, a trust that went beyond professionalism. As they worked to stabilize a critically injured patient, Melissa felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but also something else, a sense of grounding. Kate was there, steady and sure, her presence a constant reminder that Melissa wasn't alone. "Pressure's dropping," Kate said, her voice calm but urgent. "I see it," Melissa replied, her hands moving with precision. "Get me another unit of blood, now." Kate was already moving, her efficiency unmatched. Together, they fought to save the patient, their teamwork a testament to the bond they had forged. And when the patient's vitals finally stabilized, Melissa felt a surge of something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or relief. "Good work," she said, glancing at Kate. Kate smiled, her eyes warm. "You too, doctor." Later that night, as the hospital quieted down, Melissa found herself in the on-call room, staring at the ceiling. She was exhausted, but her mind was racing. The day had been a reminder of why she loved her job, but also of how much she had to lose. The thought of something happening to Kate, of losing her, was unbearable. As if sensing her turmoil, Kate appeared in the doorway. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" Melissa sat up, running a hand through her hair. "Yeah, just thinking." Kate stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "About?" "This," Melissa said, gesturing between them. "Us. What happens if something goes wrong?" Kate sat down beside her, her expression thoughtful. "We can't control everything, Melissa. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Love isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding someone worth taking the risk for." Melissa looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her words. Kate wasn't asking for guarantees or promises. She was asking for honesty, for vulnerability, for the chance to build something real. "I'm not good at this," Melissa admitted, her voice breaking. "At letting people in, at caring." Kate reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "You're better at it than you think." Melissa exhaled a shaky breath, her walls crumbling. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't," Kate said, her voice steady. "Not if we fight for this. Together." Melissa nodded, her heart full. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had something worth fighting for. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Melissa and Kate stood outside the hospital, the world waking up around them. The air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold, and for a moment, everything felt possible. "You know," Kate said, her voice light, "we make a pretty good team." Melissa smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Yeah, we do." Kate leaned into her, their shoulders brushing. "So what's next?" Melissa thought about it, about the challenges they would face, the obstacles they would overcome. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. "We take it one day at a time," she said. "Together." Kate smiled, her hand finding Melissa's. "Together." And as they walked back into the hospital, ready to face whatever the day would bring, Melissa felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Because love wasn't just a risk. It was a heartbeat, steady and sure, reminding her that she was alive. And for the first time, she was ready to embrace it. Months later, the hospital buzzed with its usual energy, but something had changed. The tension between Melissa and Kate had softened into something deeper, something unshakable. They still bickered, still challenged each other, but there was a warmth between them that no one could ignore. One evening, as they stood outside the hospital, the city lights casting a soft glow over them, Melissa turned to Kate. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I used to think this place was just a building. But it's not. It's the people. It's you." Kate smiled, her eyes shining. "And you. You're the heart of this